November 11th, 1943, 22,000 feet above Rabaul, South Pacific. The sun flashes off the canopy just long enough to blind Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Butch O'Hare, Jr. as he rolls his fighter to the left. The engine in front of him growls, not the high, elegant whine of a Japanese Zero, but a deeper, heavier sound. A working sound. A sound that feels more like machinery than finesse. Below him the ocean is calm. Too calm. O'Hare tightens his grip on the stick and glances at the fuel gauge. Plenty left. Ammunition full. His aircraft feels solid around him, armored, stubborn, almost clumsy compared to the planes he trained against before the war. The Japanese pilots he has faced in recent months have said as much themselves. Heavy, slow, easy. That is what they call the new American fighter. The Grumman F6F Hellcat. Japanese reconnaissance pilots have already reported it. Bigger than the Wildcat, thicker wings, a bulky fuselage, too much metal, too much engine. They believe it is a mistake, a response born of fear rather than skill, an aircraft that tries to win by brute force what it cannot win with grace. They laugh about it in briefings. Some of them laugh in the air. O'Hare sees movement ahead. 3 specks climbing fast, sunlight catching their wings. He recognizes the shape immediately. A6M Zeros. Light. Agile. Deadly in the hands of experienced men. For 2 years, these aircraft have dominated the Pacific skies, carving through American formations with tight turns and ruthless precision. The Japanese pilots believe they are about to do it again. The Zeros angle toward O'Hare's section, confident, almost playful. One of them slides into a shallow turn, trying to bait the American into a classic dogfight. A slow, tightening spiral where the Hellcat should bleed energy and die. O'Hare does not take the bait. Instead, he pushes the throttle forward. The Hellcat surges ahead, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine roaring as 2,000 horsepower pulls the aircraft into a shallow dive. The airframe shudders, but it holds. The speed builds fast, faster than the Japanese pilot expects. The Zero overshoots. In a heartbeat, the geometry of the fight changes. O'Hare pulls up hard, the Hellcat responding with surprising authority. The Zero tries to turn inside him, and fails. The Japanese pilot corrects, then corrects again, confused now. This American fighter is not supposed to climb like this. It is not supposed to take punishment. It is not supposed to keep coming. O'Hare lines up the shot. 650 caliber machine guns open fire at once. The sky fills with tracer rounds. The Hellcat does not vibrate or twist like earlier fighters. It absorbs the recoil. The Zero erupts in smoke and flame, disintegrating in a way O'Hare has seen too many times before. But this time, something feels different. It feels easy. The remaining Japanese pilots break away, startled. One tries to climb vertically. The Hellcat follows, not as quickly, but steadily, relentlessly. Another Zero dives for speed. The Hellcat stays above him, choosing position over pride. The engagement lasts less than 3 minutes. When it ends, the sky is empty. Back at base, O'Hare climbs down from the cockpit and pulls off his helmet. The ground crew stares at the Hellcat's fuselage. Bullet holes pepper the wings. A jagged tear runs along the tail. The plane is still flyable. One mechanic runs a hand over the armor plate behind the cockpit and whistles softly. "They hit you good, sir." O'Hare nods, "Yeah." Then he looks back at the aircraft. The thick wings, the oversized engine, the blunt nose, and says quietly, "They underestimated it." So did the Japanese High Command. For decades, Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine had been built around pilot skill and maneuverability. Aircraft were designed light, with minimal armor, minimal fuel protection, and maximum agility. The Zero was the ultimate expression of that philosophy, lethal in the hands of veterans who had spent years perfecting aerial combat over China. But by late 1943, something had changed. America was no longer improvising. The Hellcat was not built to impress Japanese pilots. It was built to kill them, and soon the mocking laughter would vanish from Japanese briefings, replaced by something far more dangerous. Silence. December 1943. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Bethpage, New York, and the skies of the Central Pacific. The Japanese pilots never saw the factory. They never saw the long assembly lines stretching across Long Island, where the air smelled of oil, aluminum shavings, and hot rivets. They never heard the rhythm of production, the constant hammering, the shouted measurements, the low hum of machines that did not stop when the sun went down. If they had, they might not have laughed so easily. The F6F Hellcat was not designed in response to theory. It was designed in response to blood. Every report from the Pacific in 1942 had been read, studied, dissected. Every encounter with the Zero, every loss, every weakness fed directly into the Hellcat's shape. Grumman engineers had reached a blunt conclusion early on. Do not try to outturn the Zero. Instead, outlast it. The Hellcat was heavier because it was armored, slower in tight turns because it carried fuel that did not explode at the first hit, less elegant because it was built around an engine powerful enough to recover from mistakes. Most important of all, it was built so an average American pilot could survive against an expert Japanese ace. That alone made it revolutionary. By late 1943, Hellcats were reaching the fleet in numbers that dwarfed anything Japan could match. Young pilots fresh from training climbed into cockpits that felt forgiving, stable, predictable. The Hellcat did not punish hesitation. It did not snap roll into the ocean if mishandled. It gave its pilot time to think, and thinking pilots lived longer. In Japanese briefings, the early encounters were dismissed. "The American plane is strong," one pilot reported after a skirmish near Wake Island. "But it turns poorly. It relies on speed, not skill," another added, almost dismissively. "It fights like a truck." That phrase circulated widely. Truck. To Japanese aviators raised on elegance and precision, the Hellcat felt crude. A blunt instrument flown by men they believed were less trained, less disciplined, less refined. But in the air, refinement did not stop 50 caliber rounds. By January 1944, U.S. Navy squadrons began to standardize new tactics around the Hellcat's strengths. Pilots were instructed never to follow a Zero into a low-speed turn. Instead, they dove, climbed, and attacked from above, boom and zoom, delivered again and again. Japanese pilots tried to adapt. They attempted higher altitude engagements. They tried baiting tactics. They tried coordinated attacks meant to overwhelm the heavier American fighters. It worked less often with every encounter. A Hellcat could absorb punishment that would have shredded a Zero. Fuel tanks self-sealed. Control cables ran redundantly. Armor plate behind the pilot turned fatal hits into survivable scares. And when a Hellcat was hit badly, the pilot often came home. In contrast, Japanese losses became permanent. Experienced pilots were not replaced. Training programs were rushed. Flight hours were reduced. The skill gap that once defined Japanese naval aviation began to collapse. By spring 1944, Japanese commanders noticed something chilling. They were losing not just aircraft, but time. Every engagement favored the Americans. Even a stalemate drained Japan more than the United States. A damaged Hellcat could be repaired. A wounded American pilot could train others. A lost Zero and its pilot were gone forever. Still, many Japanese pilots clung to pride. They mocked the Hellcat in private conversations. They told themselves that the Americans relied on numbers because they lacked spirit. That mass production could never replace skill. Then came the Philippines. In June 1944, the U.S. Navy moved to seize the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. For Japan, these islands were not optional. They were the last barrier between the American fleet and the homeland. The Imperial Japanese Navy assembled everything it had left. Carrier air groups, depleted but defiant. Pilots with barely half the training of their predecessors. Aircraft patched and overworked. Commanders hoping for one decisive battle that would reverse the war. They would get their battle, and the Hellcat would be waiting. By the time Japanese pilots climbed into their cockpits for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the laughter was already fading. They no longer mocked the Hellcat openly. They feared it, even if they refused to admit it. Because by now, they had learned a terrible truth. The Hellcat did not need to be better in every way. It only needed to be better long enough. June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea, west of Saipan. The carrier decks are already alive before dawn. On the flight deck of USS Lexington, deck crews move with practiced urgency, yellow and blue shirts, signaling through hand gestures learned under pressure. Engines cough, then roar. Propellers blur into translucent discs as the first F6F Hellcats are rolled forward, wings folded out and locked into place. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu tightens his shoulder straps and lowers his goggles. The air smells of fuel and salt. He can feel the carrier vibrating beneath him as the ship turns into the wind. Over the radio, the call comes in calm and controlled. Bogies inbound. Bearing 270, multiple groups. The Japanese are coming. Far to the west, beyond the curve of the Earth, the Imperial Japanese Navy has launched nearly everything it has left. 4 carrier air groups, hundreds of aircraft. The plan is desperate but simple. Overwhelm the American carriers with mass, break their air cover, and turn the tide in a single blow. Japanese pilots climb steadily, scanning the sky ahead. Many of them are young. Some have never landed on a carrier at night. Their briefings have been short. Fuel margins are thin. Return routes uncertain. But they fly on. They believe this is the moment they were promised. At altitude, the Hellcats form up in loose, flexible formations. Not rigid lines, but layered defenses. Radar-guided fighters are already vectoring toward the incoming threat. Unlike earlier battles, the Americans know where the enemy is before visual contact. The sky begins to fill with contrails. Then the shooting starts. Vratsiu spots the first group of Japanese aircraft, Zeros, Judys, Vols, shimmering in the sunlight. They are higher than expected, pressing forward aggressively. He does not hesitate. "Here we go," he mutters. The Hellcats dive. The first pass is devastating. American fighters slash through the formation, firing short, controlled bursts. A Zero bursts into flame. Another sheds a wing. A Judy spirals downward, trailing smoke. The Japanese pilots try to respond, but chaos spreads instantly. The formation breaks. Individual pilots fight individual battles. Exactly what the Americans want. Vratsiu lines up another target and fires. The Hellcat bucks slightly as 6 machine guns speak in unison. His guns fall silent just as the enemy aircraft disintegrates. He pulls up, rolls, and dives again. The Hellcat's strength shows everywhere. It dives faster than the Zero. It climbs steadily out of danger. It shrugs off hits that would have killed its pilot in a lighter aircraft. When Japanese pilots attempt tight turns, the Hellcat simply refuses to follow, instead climbing, resetting, and attacking again from above. Below them, the Japanese attack collapses into fragments. Over the course of the morning, wave after wave meets the same fate. American pilots radio back reports that almost sound unreal. Splash 1, 2 more down. Enemy breaking up. Japanese pilots who survive their first engagement retreat in confusion, only to be intercepted again by fresh Hellcats vectored in by radar. Many never even see the carriers they were sent to destroy. By midday, the scale of the disaster becomes clear. More than 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day. American losses barely exceed a few dozen, many of them due to fuel exhaustion rather than enemy fire. The pilots begin to call it something else over the radio. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It is not bravado. It is shock. Japanese commanders aboard their carriers listen to the reports in silence. Aircraft launched do not return. Radios go quiet. Deck crews wait for planes that never appear. For the first time, it is not American pilots counting losses. It is the Japanese. The Hellcat has done exactly what it was built to do. It has not merely won a dogfight, it has erased entire air groups. Veteran Japanese aviators, once the elite of the Pacific, are gone. Their replacements are gone with them. And the worst part? The Americans are already landing, refueling and rearming for tomorrow. When the sun sets, the Philippine Sea is littered with wreckage. Parachutes drift aimlessly. Oil slicks spread across the water. The Japanese fleet withdraws, shattered, knowing it cannot replace what it has lost. For the pilots who mocked the Hellcat months earlier, there is no laughter left. Only the understanding that they have faced something fundamentally different. Not a better plane, a better system. June 20th, 1944. Philippine Sea, and the long return home. Dawn rises over a quieter ocean. For the first time in years, the Imperial Japanese Navy's flight decks are almost empty. Crews stand beside parked aircraft that will never fly again. Some stare at the horizon. Others stare at the deck, unwilling to meet each other's eyes. The air groups are gone, not damaged, not scattered. Gone. Japanese pilots who survived the previous day return in ones and twos, fuel gauges hovering near empty, hands shaking as they bring their aircraft down. Some miss the deck entirely. Others crash on landing. The losses continue even without American guns firing. On the American carriers, the mood is different. Not celebratory, but stunned. Pilots gather around intelligence boards as updated tallies are written in chalk. The numbers climb higher than anyone expected. Squadron commanders exchange glances that say the same thing without words. This shouldn't have been this one-sided. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu sits on the wing of his Hellcat, helmet off, sweat drying on his face. His aircraft is streaked with oil and powder residue. A crewman patches another bullet hole with practiced ease. "How many?" someone asks. Vraciu shrugs, stopped counting. By the end of June the 20th, the final numbers settle in. The Japanese have lost nearly 400 aircraft, and with them, the core of what remains of their naval aviation. The Americans lose fewer than 130, many not to combat, but to fuel shortages during long-range pursuits. The imbalance is staggering, but for Japanese command, the real disaster is not the aircraft. It is the pilots. Carrier aviation had been the soul of Japanese naval power since Pearl Harbor. It had taken years to train these men, years Japan no longer had. And now, in 2 days, that soul has been torn out. Back in Japan, the news arrives slowly, filtered through euphemism and silence. Reports avoid specifics. Losses are described as heavy, but acceptable. No mention is made of annihilation. But among the pilots who remain, the truth spreads quickly. They no longer joke about American fighters. They no longer mock the Hellcat. In ready rooms and barracks, surviving aviators speak in low voices about a plane that could not be shaken, could not be outturned long enough to matter, and could not be destroyed quickly enough to survive. They speak of an enemy that always seemed to have another fighter waiting above them, another patrol, another wave. Another day. In the weeks that follow, American operations expand relentlessly. The Marianas fall. Airfields are built. Long-range bombers arrive. Japan's strategic position collapses piece by piece. The Hellcat is everywhere. It escorts bombers. It sweeps ahead of fleets. It patrols endlessly, day after day, flown by pilots who rotate home, rest, and return while their aircraft are repaired and upgraded. Japanese aircraft evolve too, but too late. New models appear without enough trained pilots to fly them properly. Fuel shortages limit training. Radar coverage remains poor. Coordination frays. The imbalance grows wider with every engagement. What began as mocking disbelief becomes fatal certainty. Japanese pilots no longer ask what the Hellcat is. They ask how many there are, and the answer is always the same: too many. Because the Hellcat is not alone. Behind it stand factories untouched by bombing, shipyards launching carriers faster than they can be sunk, training programs producing pilots by the thousands, logistics chains that stretch from Midwestern steel mills to Pacific carrier decks without breaking. By late 1944, the Hellcat's kill ratio exceeds 19-1, not because it is invincible, but because it never fights alone. Japanese aviation doctrine, once the envy of the world, is now obsolete. It was built for decisive battles, not sustained ones. For brilliance, not replacement. For perfection, not endurance. America, by contrast, has built a machine that accepts loss and overwhelms it. For the men who once laughed at the Hellcat's bulk and bluntness, the realization comes too late. They did not lose to a plane. They lost to arithmetic, to production curves, to time. And by the time the skies over the Philippines fall silent again, the outcome of the Pacific Air War is no longer in doubt. The Hellcat has not just won a battle. It has ended an era, late 1944, early 1945, across the Pacific theater. The lesson of the Philippine Sea does not stay confined to briefing rooms or after-action reports. It travels. It spreads from carrier to carrier, from airfield to airfield, from surviving Japanese pilots to those who have yet to see combat. And everywhere it goes, the message is the same, spoken quietly, sometimes reluctantly. The balance is gone. For American pilots flying the F6F Hellcat, the war has changed shape. The fear that once defined every takeoff begins to recede. Not vanish, never vanish, but soften. The sky no longer feels like hostile territory owned by the enemy. It feels contested, then increasingly controlled. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, soon to become the Navy's top ace, feels it during sweeps over the Philippines. His Hellcat climbs steadily, predictably. The radio crackles with calm instructions. Wingmen hold formation. When Japanese aircraft appear, they are fewer, disorganized, often too late. McCampbell does not chase recklessly. He does not need to. He waits. The Hellcat allows him to wait. That is its quiet genius. Where the Zero demands constant motion, constant perfection, the Hellcat allows patience. It allows mistakes. It allows pilots to disengage, climb, regroup, and return. The airplane forgives, and forgiveness in war is deadly. Japanese pilots feel the opposite pressure. Every engagement now feels final. Fuel is scarce. Aircraft are irreplaceable. Pilots know that if they break off, another Hellcat will likely be waiting higher, faster, fresher. They know that damage they might once have ignored will now doom them on the return flight. Survival becomes improvisation. Doctrine collapses. Instructors back home shorten training syllabi. New pilots are rushed to the front with a fraction of the flight hours once considered mandatory. Some arrive having never fired their guns in combat conditions. Others have never faced coordinated fighter opposition. They are sent anyway, against Hellcats flown by men who have already survived half a dozen battles. The results are predictable. By early 1945, American carrier air groups no longer fly defensively. They hunt. They sweep ahead of amphibious landings. They patrol Japanese airspace itself. The Hellcat becomes less a fighter than a gatekeeper, deciding who is allowed into the sky at all. Japanese pilots adapt psychologically, if not tactically. They stop mocking. They stop underestimating. Some begin to speak of American aircraft as unstoppable, even supernatural. Others recognize the truth, but find it harder to accept. The Hellcat is not unbeatable. It is replaceable. And so are its pilots. In ready rooms aboard American carriers, the tone remains professional, almost mundane. Pilots discuss engine performance, ammunition jams, minor improvements. The Hellcat becomes part of the background. Reliable, expected, taken for granted. That is its final victory. Weapons that inspire awe eventually fade. Weapons that become routine win wars. As kamikaze attacks begin to replace traditional air combat, the Hellcat adapts again. It intercepts suicide aircraft. It strafes airfields. It flies ground attack missions it was never originally designed for. Still, it keeps flying. Still, it keeps coming back. By the time American forces approach Okinawa, Japanese air power exists largely in theory. The skies belong to the United States, not because of one miracle aircraft, but because of what that aircraft represents, a philosophy. The Hellcat is the physical expression of an industrial society at war. It is built not to showcase brilliance, but to survive contact with reality. To protect pilots long enough for experience to accumulate, to allow training to matter, to let numbers compound instead of collapse. Japanese pilots had mocked it because it violated everything they had been taught about air combat. They believed war belonged to the exceptional. America believed war belonged to the prepared. In the end, only one belief could scale. By the spring of 1945, the laughter that once followed reports of the Hellcat is long gone. In its place is resignation, acceptance, sometimes quiet admiration, for a machine that never needed to be loved, only trusted, and trusted enough to show up again tomorrow. Summer 1945. The Pacific skies grow quiet. The war is still burning on the ground, but in the air, something fundamental has changed. For Japanese pilots who remain alive, instructors, wounded veterans, men pulled back to train the next desperate wave, the Hellcat has become a reference point. Not just an aircraft, but a dividing line in memory. Before the Hellcat, after the Hellcat, those who flew before remember a time when skill could bend fate, when a tighter turn, a sharper instinct, or a moment of courage could flip the odds. They remember laughing at American fighters, clumsy wildcats, underpowered buffaloes, and believing that spirit would always compensate for steel. Those who flew after know better. They speak of engagements where nothing worked, where altitude advantage vanished, where surprise dissolved into radar warnings and intercept vectors, where escape only led into another trap set by fresh fighters already climbing to meet them. The Hellcat does not chase glory. It denies options. American pilots continue to rotate home. They teach, they rest. They return with more experience than the men they replace. Japanese pilots do not rotate. They disappear. By August 1945, the numbers are no longer debated. The F6F Hellcat has destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other fighter in history. Its kill ratio, exceeding 19-1, is not the product of legend, but of consistency. Thousands of identical aircraft flown in identical ways by pilots trained to fight as a system, not as heroes, as components. In Japan, airfields stand empty or cratered. Fuel drums sit dry. New aircraft designs exist only on paper or in tiny numbers. The war has outrun the philosophy that began it. When the surrender comes, it feels inevitable to those who watched the skies. American Hellcats sit parked in long rows on carrier decks, paint faded by sun and salt. Many will never fly in combat again. Some will be scrapped. Others will become trainers, museum pieces, footnotes. But for the pilots who faced them, the memory does not fade. They remember the moment the laughter stopped, the moment the enemy fighter did not turn when expected, did not fall when hit, did not run out of pilots. They remember realizing that courage could not outrun production, that brilliance could not replace logistics, that the war had already been decided somewhere far from the cockpit, in factories, training schedules, fuel depots, and planning rooms that never made headlines. The Hellcat was never meant to be admired. It was meant to arrive on time, to work in bad hands as well as good ones, to come back damaged and return repaired. And that is why it won. Not because Japanese pilots lacked skill, not because American pilots lacked fear, but because one side built a weapon for a moment, and the other built a weapon for a war. The mocking stopped when reality arrived, and reality, in the Pacific skies, wore thick wings, heavy armor, and .650 caliber guns, flying in formation day after day until nothing was left to challenge it.